Good evening, friends. We are continuing we're into the last part of this wonderful book, In Divine Friendship, collection of letters by Swami Kriyananda. And that's all I'm going to say before we pray. We'll talk as soon as we're done. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence in all that we do, that we may act not from our own whims and fancies, but from the deep inspiration we feel in your presence, that all of our actions will emanate divine love, divine kindness, divine compassion for all. We are thy children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. Let's just take a couple of minutes of silence and then we'll start. Om. Peace. Amen. Okay, my friends. This book is divided into many sections. We just went through the long Yoga and Christianity section. This section is called Self-Realization Fellowship. And it's some 40 pages. But I'm making some executive decisions here. Self-Realization Fellowship, presumably most of you know, but in case you don't, in 1920, a master came to America from India, Paramahansa Yogananda. In 1925, he settled in Los Angeles and obtained a hilltop building complex, which had been a hotel. It's called the mountain, and the building was called Mount Washington. And there he set up the headquarters of what became an international organization. And it was the American branch of what he'd already set up in India. In India, he called it Yogoda Satsanga Society. Yogoda was a word that Master himself coined. And at the moment, I can't quite tell you what it means, but it's off of the word yoga, of course. Satsang means fellowship. So when he came to America, he decided to put everything in English because he was not trying to Indianize the American culture. And in the 1920s, he was really a pioneer in what has now become the globalization of our country and of California. But at the time, he was a unique feature. So he called it Self-Realization Fellowship. He did not coin the word self-realization. That became a significant issue decades later. But it was a word that was used by many other India-inspired groups because it perfectly describes what the goal of the path is, to realize the divine self within. So when Swami Kriyananda read Autobiography of a Yogi in 1948, the book was published in 1946, and he felt profoundly transformed by reading that book, left immediately to go from New York to California to meet Yogananda, who was still in the body and was living at the Mount Washington headquarters of the organization he had founded, which had become someone established by then. There was a church in Hollywood, there was a church, I believe, in Pasadena, perhaps in Long Beach, in Phoenix, Arizona. So it was more than just, it was really underway. And the unity between the American Self-Realization Fellowship and Yogoda Satsanga in India, Master was working on bringing all of that together. And there were meditation groups, and it was a thriving entity. There was a church in San Diego and Encinitas also. So when Swami came to become a disciple of Master, there was one expression of Master's work, and that was the expression that Master himself had started and was personally carrying on. Master died in 1952, 3.5 years after Swami was accepted as a disciple. By that point, Swamiji was the head of the monks, a job that had been given to him by Master. He was also one of the most prominent ministers, both because of his beautiful singing and chanting, and also because he was a natural as a teacher. So for the next 10 years after that, so a total of 14 years, for the next 10 years, Swamiji continued to serve within Self-Realization Fellowship and was eventually elevated to the position of vice president and put on the board of directors. He was the first person elevated to the board of directors after Master's passing. When Dr. Lewis died, who was Master's first disciple in America, it left the opening both as vice president and as board member, and Kriyananda was the natural choice and was elevated to that position. That's significant because of all the controversy that ensued later, that the first time there was an opportunity after Master's passing to put someone in that position, Swami was the one who was chosen. So now let me think. Okay, yes. So in 1958, Swamiji was sent to represent SRF in India because during the last 3 years of Master's life, and Swami was only with him for 3.5 years, Master intended to go to India and intended to take Swami Kriyananda with him, and he wanted Swamiji to travel around India teaching the self-realization teachings and preparing the way so that Master could come after him and there would be publicity and interest already. So because of Master's intention to have Swami represent him and the work in India, in 1958, when the board of directors, Dayamata was president, Taramata was vice president, Ananda Mata was secretary, treasurer. These are all long-time female disciples of Master. Swami Kriyananda was the only man on the board of directors, and it was a 7 or 9 person board, and it was all women plus him, which, you know, gives things a certain lean. They lean in a certain direction if they're if they're not gender balanced. It's very rare for something that is not gender balanced to not also reflect whatever the dominant reality is, whether it's masculine or feminine. So Swami Kriyananda went to India in 1958. Dayamata and Anandamata went with him, traveled with him. They traveled in India for a year. Dayamata was now president, and Master had not returned to India for the last, 15 years of his life. He was there in 1935. He died in 1952, and he only went once. He left India in 1920. He returned in 1935. He died in 1952. So there hadn't been any officials from SRF traveling to India in all that period of time. But in 1958, Dayamata decided as president it was time, because she was also president of YSS, that was totally unfamiliar with what the work was like over there. So they all went over, and then Swami, it had been arranged in advance. The women stayed for a year, and when they went back to America, they left Swami Kriyananda to work in India as their representative. Swami was very bold in his ideas of what was possible. He was very popular as a speaker. He had grown up in Europe. He was 13 before he came to live in the United States. He grew up speaking 4 European languages. He traveled extensively in Europe. He crossed the Atlantic for the first time when he was 6 months old. So it was not, he had lived in Romania, which was sort of a crossroads between the East and West. So for him, being in India was a very natural reality, and he started learning both Hindi and Bengali. He said he only learned a certain amount because everyone there enjoyed speaking English to him. But nonetheless, he became he didn't lecture in those languages, but he was conversant. He wasn't fluent. And he was very popular, and he was very bold in his ideas for how they could build Master's work. And he conceived of this idea of putting a beautiful temple in the capital city of New Delhi. Now, this is like India became a country in 1948. That's when it became independent from India. Now, sometimes I get confused whether it was 48 or 49, but it was right then. It was right when Swami came to be a disciple of Master was the time when India obtained its freedom from England. And so it was in 1958, I might have been saying, what am I saying? Yes, 1958. India had only been a country for 10 years. And the capital city was extremely influential. And even though YSS was mostly settled in Calcutta, Swami saw that the real influence for all of India was New Delhi. Plus, the work of YSS in Calcutta was sort of already established along certain tracks that had been going on since Master left for America in 1920. Delhi was a fresh field, and Swami felt he could establish new ideas more readily in Delhi. And with Dayamata's permission, he went to Delhi to see what he could accomplish. He conceived of this idea to build an impressive temple in the heart of the city on land that had been set aside as a green belt. And so for parks and to keep trees and a natural area in the heart of the urban area. It was very difficult for a spiritual society to be given land in that area. It was tightly controlled by the national government. And through a series of remarkable events, Swami had a personal meeting with Prime Minister Nehru, and Nehru personally approved that the land that Swamiji wanted, right in the heart of New Delhi, should be gifted to him by the government. So it was a huge victory. And Swamiji had been so concentrated on developing, winning the permission of the Indian government. He said the situation was peculiar. It was either all or nothing. If the government gave him the land, he had the money, everything could follow. If the government didn't give him the land, the whole idea was nothing. So there was no progress report. It was he soon learned that the only person who could give him permission was Nehru. Swami focused on having the interview with Nehru and getting his permission, and without that there was nothing to report. So when he finally reported back to his Los Angeles board of directors, they seemed completely surprised at what he'd done. Dayamata knew what he was doing, but when the other board members expressed dismay at his extraordinarily bold action, she did not defend him. Now, for a long time, tension had been building. Swami was the only man, and among all the women on the board of directors, their idea of what it was to serve Master and what Master's work was supposed to be was very, very different from Swamiji's. There was just no. He was masculine in his thinking. They were very feminine in their thinking, which means they were building a home for the devotees, which is a wonderful thing to do. And the masculine energy would think about going out and spreading the teachings around the world. The two of them are perfectly compatible and utterly complementary to each other. But if one dominates too much, so we're building our home felt very threatened by we're going out to conquer the world. That's putting it in the most simplistic terms that doesn't begin to do justice. So what happened was, in July of 1962, Swami was summoned from India, but not to Los Angeles where he lived, but to New York City. He was met there by the board of directors. They informed him that as of that moment, his services were no longer required or desired, and he was expelled. He'd been 14 years a monk. He was 36 years old. He had no life, no friends, no ambition except to remain in his guru's organization and serve it. And suddenly he wasn't going to be allowed to do that. And he was devastated. As it happened, his parents had been in Europe and were passing through New York. He got into the back seat of their car, drove across the country to Northern California. His parents live actually right near the Palo Alto community. They live in the town, a couple of towns down the road, 5 miles from here. He arrived at his parents' house. He was forbidden to contact any SRF members. He abandoned all the work and the hundreds of devotees he had developed for Master in India. He was forbidden to contact any of them. He simply disappeared. And there he was at his parents' house. He was penniless and friendless and had no idea what he was going to do. He couldn't believe that the misunderstanding wouldn't soon resolve, but over time he realized that it wasn't going to resolve, and never did resolve, in fact, until the end of his life. Now, the expectation of SRF, as Swamiji said, strategically they actually made a serious error, he said. He was a fully professed monk who was under obedience. They could have ordered him into seclusion, and he would have stayed in seclusion for the rest of his life because he was committed to the ashram, the monastic ashram life. Instead, they expelled him, which is to say they expelled him from the organization, and they expelled him from the monastic order, which effectively absolved Swamiji they repudiated any spiritual association with him, and thereby absolved him of his monastic obedience. Swamiji did his best for many years after it to behave as if that obedience was still in place, but the only instruction he ever received was to disappear and do nothing. And he said the only instruction that was utterly unacceptable to him is that he would stop serving his guru. He intended to serve his guru through SRF, but if SRF refused to allow him to, and I'm not sure which letters I'm reading, whether this is in there, but Swami would donate money and they would return his donations or not cash his checks. He offered to sell books for them. They refused to allow him to sell books. Just everything Swami tried in any way to contribute to Master's work through SRF, the door was absolutely slammed in his face. And only when he saw that he would never be allowed to do anything through SRF did he turn his mind to what else he might be able to do. Because as I said a moment ago, and he said emphatically, the only option that he refused was to do nothing to serve his guru. So that is the whole context. And when I met Swami in 1969, he'd been out of SRF for 7 years, and he had begun the work of Ananda. The whole story of how he did that is all extraordinarily well told in a book called A Place Called Ananda, which has been renamed to say something like individual creativity and the necessity of group cooperation. I'm not sure. That's a terrible title. It's a much better title than that, but I'm sure you can find it as A Place Called Ananda, where everything I've just summarized in 15 minutes is told at great length. Now, this fact of him being expelled from his guru's work and what turned out to be estranged from his guru bhais for the rest of his life was the defining reality of Swami's life, a defining reality. It never ceased to be a factor. And it was a factor for many reasons. One of them was Swamiji himself felt, Swamiji was very orthodox and he was very loyal to Master and he wanted to be a disciple. And so when he found himself outside of the organization his Master had founded, and on the outs with all the other direct disciples, he was not casual about that. He was not like, well, what do they know, or anything like that. He was constantly weighing all his actions in light of their disapproval for many years as an effort to see if he could promote harmony, and always as an effort not to be presumptuous and just think that he was right and they were wrong. He constantly re-examined his first premises to the point of utter frustration for those of us who met him only after he was separated. But he never gave it up. Now, in the years that I was writing the book Lightbearer, which was published in 2019, which I highly recommend. It's quite a good book because the subject matter is so excellent. And the way I ended up writing that, it was a year-by-year account of what Swamiji did during that year, what he was thinking, why he was thinking it. My intention in writing the book was to show step by step how Ananda unfolded under Swami's guiding inspiration, and not merely what he did, but what were the principles that motivated him, what were the principles that informed his decisions, for the primary purpose so that we can continue with the same attuned spirit that he had. Now, for 12 years, from 1990 to 2002, SRF, Self-Realization Fellowship, was profound. Oh, I know what I started to say. When SRF, as Swami said, made the strategic error of expelling him rather than merely isolating him, he said basically they used all their ammunition in one great burst that they thought would eliminate Swamiji as an issue in their lives. They were convinced that without SRF's name and without SRF's money, Swamiji would simply fade away into the night. They never considered that he would have the magnetism, the spiritual magnetism, and I have to say the words, the grace of his guru, to be able to establish himself, establish Ananda, and do everything he did, not only with no support from SRF, but with constant antagonism. So what happened was, they thought he would just go away, but he didn't go away at all. In fact, as the years went by, Swami's work became more and more impressive, and his creativity was prolific, and his ideas were highly imaginative. And so what happened was, SRF had a theological position, and their theological position was that SRF is the appointed channel for the dissemination of the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda, and that the president of SRF is the sole authorized representative of Paramahansa Yogananda in the world. Period. This is a very familiar chant. We know this. This is called the Catholic Church. This is called the Pope. And the Pope, they say, takes his authority directly from St. Peter, who got it from Jesus, and everybody else is an interloper. So it wasn't a very original idea, but it was the idea that they put forward. Swamiji never felt, and it appears as though Master's spiritual successor, Rajasi, was in tune with Swami's idea that such an institutionalized and such a sectarian definition of Master's work, Swamiji never felt that it was what Master intended. And that fact, was the defining reality of Swami's life. And he came to feel, and even felt it somewhat at the time, that Master himself engineered Swamiji's separation from SRF because Swamiji would never have been able to accomplish what Master always told him he had to do. You have a great work to do. This was not a compliment. This was a divine responsibility that Master put on Swamiji, and Swamiji came to feel, it was self-evident, he would never have been able to accomplish what Master wanted to accomplish if he'd stayed within that organization. He had to be separated. And he had to be separated, as Swami said, absolutely, unequivocally, because Swami was too loyal. If there'd been any door open, Swami would have clung to it. But because every door was slammed for Swami's entire life, Swami simply had to accept that this was God's will. And by their fruits you shall know them. By the flowering of Ananda, it seems pretty obvious one can say that it had the Guru's blessings. Swami wrote this in many places. A master could have destroyed Ananda effortlessly. And in fact, any one of the many miracles that brought it into manifestation, withholding one of them would have been enough to erase the whole thing if it wasn't what Master wanted. So with all of that, I started to say, in 1990, Ananda had become such a significant force that SRF filed a massive lawsuit against Ananda. Freedom of religion is fundamental to the American way, so it couldn't be based on religious heresy. In previous centuries, you could actually go after someone for heresy, but in America, in 1990, you couldn't go after them for heresy, but you can go after them for copyright, for trademark infringement, and this is my favorite one, for publicity rights to a deceased personality, and for a couple of other things. Unfair competition and a few other things. So it was all couched in legal terms. And the essential dispute was that we are the sole authorized spokesperson and you're a heretic. You know, the interesting thing about this is in America we have a tradition of starting churches. Our European friends thought this was the weirdest thing they ever heard. But in America we start churches. And the history of new religious movements in America is very, very consistent. There is what I will call the first church of, whatever it is, the first church of self-realization, the first church of Christ scientists, the first church of Lutheran, the first church of Methodist. Whenever there's the starting energy, there's a charismatic leader, and the first church starts. Of course, they don't call themselves the first church. They just call themselves the church of, because there's only one. And for a certain period of time, that church has an unchallenged monopoly because they just made it up, or they were just inspired to do it. Let me be more respectful. Or there was a great saint or a great leader, and they made it happen. And then invariably, there's almost, I say virtually always, in the very beginning, there's some kind of a split. Either it's like it was with Swami, where someone is expelled, or someone else has a strong disagreement and they march off on their own. They do not repudiate the teaching, but they repudiate the first church of and start the second church of. And then for a long time, the first church of tries to prove that the second church of is a heretic. And it goes back and forth in all the different ways that those things can be carried out. And if the second church of has enough force, then pretty soon you have the first and the second church of, and that's just what it becomes. But it's rarely an easy transition. So here we are. Master started Self-Realization Fellowship. Swami called us anything but self-realization for a long time. What actually catalyzed the lawsuit in 1990, to be fair, was that Swamiji decided that self-realization was the name that belonged to all of Master's children. So SRF is Self-Realization Fellowship. In 1990, at Swamiji's suggestion, we became the Church of Self-Realization. Eventually, we became the Ananda Church of Self-Realization. And then Swami wrote a book called The Essence of Self-Realization. And that was what was the last straw, as far as SRF was concerned, and they filed a lawsuit. Litigation went on for 12 years and morphed. The essential initial litigation was resolved in 4 years, but it went on for another 8. And then a satellite lawsuit, which was a sexual harassment lawsuit, filed against Swami was actually never accused of sexual harassment, but the target of the lawsuit was him. It was a consensual affair between two people within Ananda, one of whom was an ordained minister. And he was married, and he started an affair with this other woman. Her name was Bertolucci, her last name. And Bertolucci lost in the competition for the man. The wife won, she lost, and eventually, with help from disgruntled others, she filed a lawsuit, which was funded and backed by SRF, because another way to win is to simply destroy Ananda's credibility and Swamiji's reputation. So it was a big adventure. And now I've spent a half an hour summarizing it all to you, all to tell you that I don't want to talk about it that much because I'm tired of it. And more than that, and this is where I was going to say about Lightbearer. However, let me be fair about this. The real issue here has nothing to do with Kriyananda. It really doesn't. It has to do with what was Master's intention, what kind of a work did he want to start? Did he intend to start a sectarian organization that would have a role like the Catholic Church? Or did he want to start a movement that belongs to everyone? And there are real theological differences. Swami Kriyananda's essential representation of Master's teaching is that every disciple has the equal potential, not necessarily the actuality, but every disciple has the equal potential to be in tune with the Guru, to receive the Guru's inspiration, and to speak in the Master's voice. Because that's what self-realization is. That's what the practice of Kriya is that I do this practice myself, I get in tune with my Guru, I can attune myself and be an instrument of his consciousness. The SRF point of view is that authority is passed down through institutional position, and that by definition the president of SRF gets the right inspiration. And depending on how extreme the point of view is, I mean, nobody else really can receive inspiration unless you have the proper position in the organization, unless you're on the board of directors or you're a senior monastic. And the monastics are more in tune than those who are householders. And it's a hierarchy, which is very common. And Ananda has a hierarchy too, because in a path where realization is gradual, it's only natural that some people would be more enlightened than others. I mean, that's the way it works. So wisdom should be honored where it exists. It's not every man for himself. It's not democratic. It's not on principle egalitarian. But it's still the guiding principle is every disciple is equal before Master. Wisdom should be honored where it's presented. Responsibility, requires cooperation. But the theological difference is tremendous. No, many people just don't even think about that. They just think, well, I go to SRF and I love Master, and you go to Ananda and you love Master, so we love each other. And let's just leave it at that. That's just terrific. I mean, that's where we need to be. Once our existence wasn't threatened by litigation, people could have any opinions they want. When we were being threatened by litigation, we had to really stand strong. Now, when I wrote Lightbearer, which is where I was coming to a little while ago, I really hoped that I wouldn't have to go into great detail about everything that happened and all those years of litigation and all of the difficulties and hardship that Swami endured from his gurubhais and on and on and on. I really hoped that I wouldn't have to do that. Just because, why? By that time I was writing in 2015, 16, 17, all the Swami had passed away, Dayamata, Taramata, Anandamata, everyone was gone, and there was new leadership at SRF. So when I finally went into seclusion to really work on that book, which was a little while before I did that, And it was given to me. I won't even say it came to me. It was given to me that the way to organize the book was the way I did, which was in very strict chronological order. Every chapter, to not 100%, to a very large extent, each chapter only contained information that was available to me during that year. So that instead of getting the end of the story at the beginning of the story, we just went through it as I went through it. And just things unfolded like this. And it became a pretty strict way of doing it. So the book starts, the first chapter is 2 years or 3 years, 69 to 71. I met Swami at the very end of 69. I moved into the ashram, into Ananda village, which was the only Ananda at that point, on June 1st of 71. So that's one year. Every other chapter is only 1 year. This is combined, only 1 year. So here I am. I've written the first chapter. I mean, wasn't such a surprise to me. In 1972, now one of the things that happened when Swami was expelled from SRF is that they, let's see, what would you say? They blackballed him with the Indian government. They said that he was a Christian missionary and a CIA agent. I mean, it was written, Swami saw his file many years later. And that was enough for the Indian government to refuse to give him a visa. So for 10 years, Swamiji couldn't go back to India. Now, Swami now says that was Master's grace, because Swami was so at home in India that if he had been able to, he probably would have gone to India and just gone into seclusion, which was not really an option in the U.S. the way it was in India. He tried to set up that life for himself in the U.S., but it just can't be done. There's no support for it. But in India, he could have done it. So God kept him out of India for a full decade, by which point he had started Ananda. There was a lot of commitment here. But in 1972, he made some contacts with some highly placed individuals in India who said they could get his visa restored. And so the government gave him a conditional visa for 30 days so he could come and plead his case. So here I am at Ananda. I have moved on June 1st of 71. It was all the way to November of 72. So it's a year and a half after I'm there, but it's chapter 2 of my book, which is Swami is now going to go back to India. This is the first time he's been back in a decade. He had thousands of people following him. He gave weekly satsangs in which several thousand people came to New Delhi. And he traveled around India. He was enormously popular as the American Swami, which at that time was a real novelty. It's not so much now, but at that time it really was. And because he could speak the language and sing the music so beautifully and so on and so on. But he vaporized. No one in India had any idea what happened to him. He just disappeared. So now he's, and what's happened in between also is Taramata, his nemesis in SRF, has died. And so Swami feels that with Tara out of the picture, he's at least hoping there'll be a softening of the energy from SRF toward him. So he's heading back to India. And he's also finished this book called Crises in Modern Thought, which that's now called Out of the Labyrinth, for those who wish to believe but can't. And this was also an enormous seminal work that Swami took upon himself as soon as right after he was expelled from SRF. He felt the idea of writing it had come to him just before he was expelled. And he felt that Master had planted the idea in his mind so that he could act on it. So huge completion now. So here I am, alone in my seclusion. And I realized that in the second chapter of the book, I need to explain why Swami going back to India is such a huge, big deal. Because it was in the evolution of Ananda, in the story I'm telling, and in the biography of Swami Kriyananda, which I'm writing. This is monumental. And I can't explain why it's so important unless I go back and explain what happened. So the book goes 69, 71, 1962, and then 1972, because I had to then tell that whole story. And that basically happened to me until Swami's final breath in 2013. It was just, this was constant. Now, it wasn't personal. Yes, there were personalities involved, and yes, Swamiji's heart was severely wounded by the way the people he felt the closest to in the world turned against him, by the complete loss of friendships that he thought were founded in God and could never be shattered. It was extraordinary from the point of view of what he had to transcend in order to keep his heart open, in order not to become bitter or discouraged or anything like that. But it was really a theological dispute. It was, what is Master's mission? And at some point during the litigation years, we decided, because we had to spend $13 million over the course of that, a little more than $1 million a year for 12 years. And that was a lot of money for us. I mean, incredible. And we started calling our campaign Master for the World, because that was the real issue. It wasn't SRF versus Ananda. It was Master for the World, or Master as a sectarian guru in this narrow way. Is Master for everybody, and can everybody draw his inspiration, or do we have to follow this narrow channel and all these little rules? Did he come to start a sect? Did he come to start a global movement? So let me just sort of, I think I'm coming to the end of this. So it was, and then what happened all through Swami's life was self-realization fellowship. Even today, Swami never put this down. Other people wanted him to put it down, but he never put it down, which is one of the reasons my book came out the way it did. Up almost literally, well, literally for me, to the very end of his life. Swami was still focused on this because he did not see that it was assured that the global concept of Master's work would prevail over the sectarian one. He felt that the karma of sectarianism is so strong. He writes this in a place called Ananda. He calls it karmic patterns. He said it's just over and over and over again in the teachings of great masters. The universal vision of the master is gradually turned into a religion, and then the religion gradually becomes sectarian. And Master's mission was to restore the original teachings of Jesus, the original teachings of Krishna, and show that they're the same teachings, and all the sectarianism and separation that's come in after the incarnation of the avatar is a total corruption. But that energy is extraordinarily strong. And even to this day, when people talk about Yogananda's work, they tend to see SRF as the founding, defining organization. And there's also Ananda that was started by this disciple. Now, depending how deeply you get into it, you may come to another point of view, but it's by no means a clear path. And it's so beautifully and dramatically illustrated by the way that Yogananda's name is spelled. Yogananda spelled his name a certain way, and after his passing, SRF was convinced by certain scholars that Master had spelled his title, Paramhansa, that he'd spelled it incorrectly. So they literally changed his signature, took an A from somewhere else, dropped it in the middle, and so Paramahansa is the way SRF spells it. Paramhansa is how Ananda spells it. But when you look at almost everything that isn't from Ananda, they choose the SRF spelling, and very few people who do that are unaware of what's going on. So in other words, it's not over. And, you know, we can be very cavalier and optimistic and so on, but these are real issues. which is why there's 40 pages in this book that is dedicated to SRF. And right in the middle of it, there's a 25-page letter. And then there's a couple of others, which I am not going to read because I've spent more than I thought I was going to spend, but I realized I had to tell you all of that to have any of this make sense. I think a person ought to read what's in this book if you're seriously interested in Master's work. And one ought not to shy away from the fact that this is very unpleasant. It just is unpleasant. These things happen. But because SRF is so strong and has been so emphatic, still, Swami would intermittently receive outraged letters from people who had become persuaded by SRF that he was a heretic. And how dare you? That would just sort of be the tone. How dare you presume to represent our great master? And so there's some letters in there like that. And I've basically gone through this 40-page section and left out the longest, most detailed that would just be impossible to wend our way through. Not because they're not important and not because I don't think you should read them. I think you should read them. It's because I feel like I do a lot on this subject, and I wrote a whole book about it. A whole book, by no means is my book about this. I wrote a book where I feel that I presented the issues and the case thoughtfully and comprehensively. And so I'm going to just do some of it now. Now, with that introduction, which was about 10 times longer than I thought it would be, but sometimes it surprises me, I'm going to read the first letter. Okay. And this is, let's see, the summary of this letter says, Self-Realization Fellowship, SRF, is the organization Paramahansa Yogananda founded in 1925. It is larger and more wealthy than Ananda, much more wealthy than Ananda. Swami Kriyananda was part of SRF from 1948 to 1962 when he was dismissed. The letters in the following section give the reasons for Kriyananda's separation from SRF and an overview of the relations between the two organizations over the years. That's a very neutral way of saying it. So, this is a letter to an SRF monk, and it's written in 1973. I'm nearly certain this letter is to a monk named Brother Turiyananda. Brother Turiyananda came to SRF after Master died, shortly after Master died. He's from Switzerland, I'm pretty sure. And Swami Kriyananda was the head monk. Was Turiyananda a direct disciple? He might have been a direct disciple. Yes, I think he was a direct disciple. I think I'm wrong in saying that he came after Master's passing, but I'm suddenly blank on that. He was from Switzerland, and Swamiji was the head monk, and Swamiji was instrumental in arranging for him to come to America, and there were certain obstacles to his coming which Swami helped sweep away. So there was a very close and deep spiritual friendship between Turiyananda and Kriyananda. And even after Swami was expelled, Turiyananda was always sort of a rebel within SRF, and he spoke his mind, and he didn't follow along. He wasn't an organization man in any way, and he was more outspokenly supportive of Kriyananda, I believe, than any other monastic there. So in 1973, Swami had been forbidden to set foot on any SRF property. But after Taramata died in 1972, Swami started testing the waters to see if there was going to be a change. So in 1973, he went to Lakeshrine, and there he saw, I believe, Turiyananda, a monk that he was close to, and it had to have been him. So Swami says, "How very good it was to see you again after nearly 13 years. And how wonderful to be in one of Master's places again." These are like Swami's childhood home. He'd been exiled from his childhood home, spiritual childhood. I feel that way about Ananda Village. I feel like it's my childhood home, even though I was 24 when I arrived there. But it was my spiritual childhood. I grew up there as a devotee. The vibrations at the lake shrine are so uplifting. I cannot but feel that everyone who comes there must go away in some way changed. I believe Turiyananda was in charge of the lake shrine. So when Swami's commending the place, he's also commending him for the way he's maintained it. Let us continue to pray to God and Master that the seeming distance between us becomes demolished. Swami uses words so carefully, seeming distance. There's an apparent separation, but Swami calls it a seeming distance rather than an actual distance. And he uses a big word like demolished. Just this seeming distance will just be demolished. It will go away. We are all serving him. It behooves devotees to feel an underlying oneness, even with criminals, what to speak of their own Gurubhais. You're hearing Swami's tone, which is the tone he follows all the way through. But the way of Maya is to emphasize differences just because they are superficial and slight, from a wish to safeguard one's own integrity. That was just a wonderful, interesting phrase. It's the way of Maya to emphasize differences so we can correspondingly elevate our own uniqueness. And it never comes to us as if that were an error. It comes to us as if that were a virtue, to protect our integrity, to be able to stand for what we stand for, to speak in our own voice. And in order to have all that uniqueness, we have to separate ourselves from everyone else. So Swami calls it Maya, to emphasize differences, because otherwise then we become part of the universal whole. The wave, even though the wave is nothing but the ocean, the wave wants to prove how big and special it is. You know, it's a paradox when you use the image of waves and the ocean, that from the worldly point of view, the bigger the wave and the higher it is and the more it stands out from the others, the more powerful and magnificent it is. Except, of course, every wave just goes up and then just comes down again because it has no separate existence from the ocean, and the nature of the ocean is that the waves rise and fall. The truly spiritual person lives very close to the ocean because its reality is the whole ocean. The avatar's reality, the saint's reality, is that they live in the awareness of their unity with the entire ocean rather than constantly emphasizing their separateness. The worldly person wants to be separate from everyone else, taller, bigger, richer, more powerful. And so Maya plays with that. Maya tries to show us why we're different and we're special and we're unique and there's never been anyone like us and we need to stand on our own and we don't have to listen to them. So this is where the way of Maya is to emphasize differences. Oh, Swami said the way Satan works with us is Satan Satan persuades us through our own false reasoning. That was how he put it, which is a very interesting statement. We think of Satan coming in with a trident and a pair of horns, but that would be too transparent. He insinuates himself into our own consciousness and feeds us thoughts that emphasize our separateness instead of our unity. And that's the whole game. That's Maya. Satan is the word we use in the West. Maya is a more subtle word. After all, he says, okay, we need therefore to keep in mind that the surest way of safeguarding our own integrity as Master's disciples is to live by his words. I think the walls are crumbling, and I am very happy to contemplate that possibility. Swami was the eternal optimist, 1973. He really thought that once Tara was gone, that Daya would reunite with him, because he felt he had a very close and positive relationship with Daya Mata, and Daya herself admitted that Tara, these are very powerful personalities, was really determined on Swami's downfall and pushed Daya to expel him. So Swami thought once Daya was freed from Tara's influence by Tara's death, that she herself would repudiate the decisions, but in that he was wrong. I think the walls are crumbling, and I am very happy to contemplate that possibility. Brother, would you please see that another monk named gets the enclosed letter? A former monk, actually. I think Ananda may be the best place for him now that he has left the SRF order. Here he can continue to serve Master. And see, this was the thing. In SRF, you had to be a monk or a nun to serve, actually. I mean, the lay people could have centers and so on, but it was the theology, has been, and I think still is, the theology of SRF that to really represent Master, you can only do it if you're a monastic. So if you start out as a monk or a nun, but then feel that that's not a lifelong lifestyle for you and leave the order, there's no other place for you. In the Ananda world, if a person takes a monastic vow for a time, but then chooses afterwards to either live on their own or to be a householder, there's a seamless flow of their ability to serve. Among the many distinctions between SRF and Ananda is that householders can have an equal role leading and representing Master, whereas SRF has been that the only people who can lead and represent Master have to be monks or nuns. See, this is once again where an external, organizationally determined position becomes the definition of your ability to serve the Guru. And this is a profound theological difference. And it's an organizational difference. Ananda is for householders, and the vast majority of leadership positions are filled by single people or householders. There are monks and nuns, but it's not a prerequisite for having a significant position of spiritual leadership. So now this monk that Swami knew had left the order, and Swami thought, well, he could continue his full-time dedication to Master at Ananda. So, here he can continue to serve Master. All of us here consider ourselves Master's disciples, and all must be SRF members to join. For many years, Swamiji made it a requirement that you couldn't be part of Ananda unless you were also an SRF member. To be an SRF member meant that you were enrolled to receive their mail order lessons. That was the primary definition of membership. So we could live at Ananda and order the SRF lessons, and then we were considered SRF members. Swami made it a requirement. It was he did everything that was allowed to him, that was open to him to do, to keep Ananda consistent with SRF guidelines, in the hope and the expectation that there would be a reconciliation, and he wanted that reconciliation to have as few hurdles as possible. So one of them was that if everybody at Ananda is an SRF member, then that sort of makes us more like the same organization. It all proved futile in the end, but this was written in 1973. I even have a job for this monk if he comes. Anyway, I've suggested to him that he at least come and see what we have. And then he says, God bless you, brother. I hope we meet again soon. The fact of the matter is, Swami extended that invitation multiple times because many monks walked away from SRF. Not a single one, certainly not a single one ever joined Ananda. And I can't say for certain, but very few ever even came to see us. Because it was bad enough that they had left the SRF monastery. If they had joined Ananda, they would have been, well, I think the only words are, it is damned to hell, because Swami was such a heretic. So they just couldn't do it. I mean, he tried, and he tried, and he tried. But it never happened. Okay, in a series, and this is another letter, this now was written in 1978. In a series of letters, an SRF member urged Kriyananda to reconcile with SRF or else refrain from any activities outside their organization. See, people would just take it upon themselves to just tell him what he ought to do and why he was in tune and why he isn't. So if you can't make peace with SRF, and they always made it seem like it was Swami's fault that there wasn't peace. Swami was constantly making overtures. But at least if you can't be part of SRF, then do nothing. You know, don't presume to serve Master outside of SRF. I mean, stop and think about that. How completely institutionalized such a very thought is. And it's completely contrary to the way things are carried out in India. In India, it's not merely sanctioned that every disciple will serve his guru. It's expected that every disciple will serve his guru. And it's generally expected that every disciple will establish his own way of serving his guru, because that's what the master needs. He needs countless voices, as Swami says in other places. How could one individual who was not himself an avatar ever encompass the full consciousness of the avatar? It's just not even logical. And so the master needs many voices. You get one institution. In fact, Swami said, ironically, SRF's emphasis on the institution caused master to be not very well respected in India, which is an interesting thing, that anthologies of great Indian saints, and up to the time when Swami came to India in 2003, master was kind of considered to be a second-rate teacher, because the emphasis of SRF and by extension YSS was so institutional that from the Indian perspective, no great master would be so institutional. It's just not the way avatars express themselves. And in the ancient tradition of India, you don't think of an avatar's teaching being like, this is the president and he's the only one who speaks, and this is the vice president and they're second only to the president. It's a discipleship tradition in which the master's consciousness is dispersed to as many as can receive him. So master was not well respected and not that well known. And even his autobiography in the edited 13th SRF edition, they added in all these references to self-realization fellowship. So even when you would read his autobiography, the words that were in that book that were attributed to Yogananda have him constantly touting the importance of his organization. And once again, from the Indian point of view, only a second-rate teacher would do that, because true avatars are beyond such petty definitions. Swami's coming to India in 2003, and the simultaneous release of the original edition of Autobiography of a Yogi, in which the institution is barely mentioned, have, in the last 20-some years, have really changed the perception of Yogananda in India. I mean, this has been told to us by many there. This is not just my point of view. Anyway, it's a very interesting point. So anyway, so here in September of 1978, Swami is trying to explain what he's done and why. And there's already been a multiple exchange of letters, and Swami is now sort of ending the exchange. Why don't we leave it at this? That I truly feel that the work I am doing is one that Master wants me to do. I feel his guidance and his blessing on it. As I wrote you earlier, I have not taken on this work without much meditation and sincere prayer for guidance. So you have Swami's word on that. If you're suspicious of Swami, you won't believe it, but that's how he explains it. I'm not casual about this. And he has, in a place called Ananda, in his own autobiography, in my book, also, you hear a great deal of how he thoughtfully made every decision. And it's relevant. It's relevant quite apart from any of this controversy. It's that Swamiji lived as a disciple, and he did not presume. And merely to say that any disciple has the potential to be in tune and to be an instrument of the Guru does not mean that every disciple can claim that authentically unless they have actually earned it. So over the course of the 45 years that I knew Swamiji and what I wrote into that book, you see over and over and over again his absolute integrity. And he never presumed. He went sometimes from our point of view, to annoying lengths to be certain his guidance was true. When we were just perfectly sure that whatever he felt to do was going to be the right thing to do, he never accepted that. So this is what he says: let's just leave it that I've meditated sincerely and deeply before I take any step. I see now, I think Master wanted me on my own, because his work, this work, could not have been done within the larger framework of SRF. Even my books, which he told me to write, would never have been published had I been in his organization. In 1978, it was like 20 years before SRF put out Master's Gita commentary or his commentary on the Bible or his books about the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. As Swami said, they weren't even publishing Master's writings. So the idea that they would actually, one, give him time to write, and two, publish what he wrote, was just increasingly unlikely. But of course, on his own, Swami we established our own publishing company, and we worked together and published all his books. I see now that this is what he meant when he told me repeatedly, you have a great work to do. A great work implies a work of this type rather than activity within something that has already been established. This is all how Swami continually reflected. After I was put out of the work, I sent donations to it, but my checks were either returned or never cashed. I offered to distribute Master's books in bookstores, and my offer was rejected. I was told in a telegram that I could do absolutely nothing to serve my Guru. Because this is an answer to why didn't you just do nothing? Well, I tried to work within SRF and they wouldn't let me. It was only then, and because the one service I could not render Master was to do nothing, that I had to turn within to seek his guidance directly. I might conclude by saying that I hope very much that someday Ananda and SRF will be able to work together. But the next steps in that direction will have to be taken by them. I've made all the offers I can, including several times in years past, offering to give Ananda to SRF. That didn't make all of us really happy, but he insisted on it. Their reaction was to suspect me either of trying to foist my debts onto them or to get rid of Ananda because it was too much trouble for me. I hope that this explanation helps you to understand the situation better. Look how kindly Swami is. I mean, he never says to this person, which, in certain ways he had every right to say, which is, what have you done for Master? How dare you? I mean, this is the kind of thing that I would say. It's just like people who went to church on Sunday at SRF. And Swami had founded communities. He'd given eventually thousands of us, but at that time hundreds of us, an extraordinarily dynamic spiritual life. He was writing books, he was lecturing, he was writing music, he was initiating people into Kriya. He was, and then someone who goes to church on Sunday writes to Swami and say, why don't you, how dare you? My response was, how dare you? But Swami never wanted that response. He always wanted just, here are the facts, take it or leave it. See how completely undefensive he was. Let's just leave it at this. I've tried to explain it to you. You're not going to understand. Let's agree to disagree. Next comes a 25-page letter in which everything that I just spent 40 minutes telling you is gone over in extreme detail, very interestingly. An SRF member again wrote to Swamiji asking him on what possible basis can he justify what he's doing. And Swami wrote a very long and comprehensive answer. It was just sort of interesting. He just felt to. And so at the time, which was, I guess it was 1999. Oh, so we'd already been, excuse me, this was a different letter, but by that time we were well into the middle of litigation years. But anyway, it was a very interesting letter, but too much. Takes us too far afield for too long. So now here's another. Let me just figure out where we are, because I'm skipping through a lot of these. Okay, now we're up to 1994. Oh, this was quite a year. Okay, SRF filed its lawsuit in 1990. And as I mentioned earlier, it was all intellectual property, copyright, trademark, publicity rights. Master set things up in a way that was very interesting. He copyrighted all his works, with certain minor exceptions, in his own name. And he never transferred those copyrights to SRF. He just died. When he died, his books and his writings was all copyright Paramahansa Yogananda. Now, if someone dies, everything, and let's see, what was the issue? It's a question of whether he had left a will or not. For a number of years of the litigation, SRF insisted that Master had not left a will. And then, after many years of litigation, suddenly they discovered that, in fact, he had left a will, that he'd left 2 wills, but none of them transferred the copyrights to SRF. They transferred the profits from the books, but not the copyrights themselves, which is one of the reasons that those wills did not appear for a long period of time. But this is a massive detail that is included in John Parsons' book, Fight for Religious Freedom, which you can actually read online on the website called Yogananda for the World. Yogananda for the World has the whole of John Parsons' book online. And actually, they're beginning to post Lightbearer also. And John goes year by year. He was our attorney. He was our attorney for all those 12 years. And he goes step by step through the whole litigation, including all kinds of fascinating things. So, let's see. Oh, yes. So, Master never transferred the copyrights. So if they belonged to anybody, they belonged to Master's relatives. If Master didn't leave a will and didn't transfer the copyrights to his organization, then his worldly possessions belonged to his heirs, to his living family. We were able to get sufficient numbers of his living relatives to declare that Yogananda's writings belong to the world. And it just, we were able to muddy the waters in that situation quite nicely. So what happened was, they had accused us of copyright infringement in a very eccentric way. I put this into Lightbearer, in a very eccentric way. Like we would have published a magazine, and when they filed their giant lawsuit against us, they would pull out issue number 12 of what particular year, and they would charge us with copyright infringement of a certain poem. But there might be a whole article there that was also drawn from Master's writings, but they didn't charge copyright infringement of that, only of this here. And so it was very eclectic, and we couldn't understand why that was so. Turns out that, well, turns out this was what happened. John Parsons, our lawyer, received what he felt was a divine inspiration directly from Master. He said that the thought was just spoken into his mind, and it wasn't his thought. And the thought was, challenge their copyrights. See, they just claimed that we were violating their copyrights, and everybody in the whole planet thought that SRF owned all of Master's writing. And John Parsons felt that Master said to him, challenge their copyrights. So one of our paralegals and one of our attorneys flew to Washington, D.C., went into the Copyright Office and started checking all the documents. And we found out that Master never transferred his copyrights. SRF usurped them. And they just went in and renewed them in their name. And you can't do that. The copyright belongs to the author unless it's transferred. So suddenly what happened was they didn't own the copyright to Master's original writings. They only owned the copyright to their edited versions. And of course, his original writings is what we wanted. And that's why now there is an original edition of Autobiography of a Yogi, because it turned out SRF didn't own it. It was in the public domain. And there's vast amounts of material in the public domain, which is why Ananda, Crystal Clarity has a whole Wisdom of Yogananda series, Master's teachings on many different subjects. Prior to this litigation, we didn't know that all that was in the public domain. And the most amazing part of it is, when we looked at the eclectic pattern of what we'd been charged with violating, SRF's lawyers knew before they filed that case against us that they were claiming copyrights. They were claiming copyrights to everything, but they didn't actually own them. It was quite fascinating. So anyway, all of that resolved by 1994. It's just like every major issue was over. They'd claimed exclusive rights to Master's name, to the word self-realization, all of it was killed. So everything that really mattered in the case was finished. So at the beginning of 94, Swami says to John Parsons, what can SRF do at this point? They've just lost all their exclusive rights. John said there's one legal concept left to them. It's called tarnishment. And it says that if if an entity, an organization, a person, whatever it is, can be proven to be morally corrupt, morally, I don't know if this is the legal phrase, but morally reprehensible is the word that I've always liked. If they can be proved to be morally reprehensible, and therefore any association between that entity and your organization would tarnish your reputation, then the courts may be willing to give you some protection against that tarnishment, which is to take away from them whatever creates the confusion. This was the word that was always used. This was so much fun as all these things came out. They kept talking about the confusion that was created by Ananda's existence. And we would say, we make it so clear that we're not SRF. Everything that you look at, you can see that it's from Ananda. We even put a disclaimer on our materials. Ananda is not affiliated with Self-Realization Fellowship. Now, Swami, we laughed about that later. It made it seem like we wanted to repudiate the affiliation. Ananda is independent. We're not associated with them. And Swami said he was amazed that they didn't realize that it looked like an insult to them rather than something to praise. But anyway, we did that, but it wasn't enough. And it finally turned out, and this was actually articulated to us, that the confusion that was caused was that anyone might think that someone other than SRF could represent Master. It was the theological dispute again. We were undermining their claim to absolute authority. And that was, quote, confusing to people because they wanted the monopoly. As Swami said often, their lawyers failed to tell them that religious monopoly is not American law. Somebody should have told them that, because that is in fact exactly what the judge said. You can't just put another religion out of business because you don't like them. It's not allowed in this country. So anyway, by 1994, the whole case was really over. As it turned out, way in the end, in the year 2000, a little piece of it was remanded back. Because SRF just appealed and appealed and appealed. They even tried to get the Supreme Court to hear the case, but they refused. But a little piece of copyright law was remanded, and we did have a trial. It sort of came back to life to haunt us back there at the end there. But tarnishment. So when John Parsons explained to Swamiji that the one way they could get exclusive rights back was tarnishment, Swamiji said, well, get ready. I mean, it was just like, of course they're going to do it. There's just no question that they're going to do it. So what happened was, a married man who was an ordained minister, who was married and had a child. And the child, probably the phrase would be on the spectrum, but it was in 1990. It was not quite as well understood at that time, but she did not grow up in the way that is common. She grew up with a lot of differences in her nature. It was very traumatic for her parents. In the midst of all of that, the husband strays, and he has this affair with this woman, but he realizes that this is a mistake. He repudiates her, reconciles with his wife, determined to make all of that work. Swamiji, of course, wanted him to make that decision, but knew he had to make it himself. But when he made it himself, Swami supported it by being very emphatic that the other woman couldn't live any longer at the village, but had to move to one of the other communities. He wanted her to go to Europe, but she didn't want to. She actually came here to Palo Alto, because here is where she had started from. And we did our best to help her. Swamiji later said, he also asked her to leave for her sake, because, as he put it, in matters of this type, sympathy tends to go to the wife, not to the other woman. And he didn't feel that the other woman could thrive in the atmosphere, although Swami also kept the whole thing pretty quiet. He was criticized later for that. But he said the wife's nature was exceedingly private. It would have been extremely difficult for her to deal with a widespread knowledge of what had happened. Of course, that's what came out in the end. And Swami also did it for the sake of the other woman, because he said the sympathy does not go to the other woman, especially not when there's a child and a difficult child, blah, blah. These things happen. So she comes here for a while, but very quick, she was enraged. She was just really, really angry. And hell hath no fury. Like an angry woman in a situation like this, she aligned herself with another ex-Ananda person who had become quite intimate with the SRF leaders, because he would speak so knowledgeably against Kriyananda. So she got connected with him. He took her to meet the SRF Board of Directors. This is all in my book and in Search for Religious Freedom. I'm not going to go into details. She got aligned with SRF. This man got her an attorney, and in November, Thanksgiving weekend of 1994, another lawsuit is filed. It's not filed by anyone who's explicitly with SRF. They're not there, but the whole lawsuit is really about Swami Kriyananda, about him being an abusive cult leader and just the whole story. Think of anything that you would say about a charismatic leader of a group like ours, and it was said. In fact, this lawyer that she had at that time had actually filed lawsuits against several other cults. And this lawsuit was literally, if you can imagine such a thing, a boilerplate anti-cult lawsuit. And in more than one place, he'd actually failed to change the name of the cult. So you're reading through this, and all of a sudden, the terrible leader and the group, it's a different group and a different leader. It was just like a typographical mistake. So it had nothing to do with us. But that was 1994. At the same time, almost exactly at the same time this lawsuit was filed, as soon as it came in Swami's hands, Swami looked at it and said, oh, This has nothing to do with the man that she was accusing. This is SRF trying to get me. And he said that just holding it in his hand. And I have to say, I have to confess, we couldn't really, we couldn't make that intuitive leap the way Swami did. Not very long later, we found all the links. We found the legal links, we found the financial links, we found the support links. We found everything that Swami had just, we found the evidence for it, where that Swami had just gotten it, holding it in his hand. But that's coming at Swami, and then Swami he'd had ever increasing heart difficulty, and it was necessary for him to have open heart surgery. He had to have not merely the arteries cleaned like some people do, but he had to have a valve replaced in his heart. He was either born with it, or he'd had this experience in India when a very great volt of electricity went through him. Well, no, Swami had a heart murmur before that because he was rejected from the army. He didn't go to war, even though he was of the age, because he had a heart murmur. So he was born with a heart murmur, which was exacerbated by the accident with the electricity. And he'd just been getting worse and worse and worse with atrial fibrillation and shortness of breath and, what do they call it? Congenital heart failure. That's what they call it. And he'd been struggling with it for years, and the doctors basically, he went for a checkup, and the doctors didn't want to let him out of the hospital. They felt that he could fall over dead at any moment. So Swami's scheduled to have in December he's going in for this huge heart surgery, like on December 6th or 7th, and on November 28th, this whole huge lawsuit is filed against him after these 4 years of struggle against the SRF lawsuit. So it was quite a moment for Swami. And the letter, which I'm not going to read tonight, but I will start with next week, is when he was in the hospital after his surgery. He had a profound vision, essentially, of the forces of light and darkness that were at war, trying to, as he said, the forces were very impersonal, and the letter explains it more, but they were very impersonal, and the dark force wanted to pull Master down and just keep him small and sectarian, and the light force wanted to give Master to the world. And that the representatives of those two points of view were the theology of SRF and the existence of Ananda. And that's what was really going on. And it was a huge, powerful vision that Swami had. And the letter that I'll start with next week is him writing to us about this experience in the hospital and his call to courageous willingness to be instruments of the light. Okay, my friends.